My mother used to say, "You're the strong one," like she was sealing me in a box and throwing away the key. It wasn't praise. It was a verdict. The words were soft, almost tender, but they carried the weight of instruction. Be sturdy. Be silent. Don't ask for anything you aren't willing to earn alone. I learned to hear it the way systems teach people to keep working. As a rule, not a compliment. My name is Amy Jensen. I grew up in a split-level house that smelled like lemon cleaner on Saturdays and burnt toast on school mornings. My father, Mark, kept a roster of practicalities: mortgage, lawn service, insurance. And my mother, Linda, kept a roster of moralities: who deserved what and why. We had two other lists, too. One was framed and hanging in the living room, photo after photo of my older sister, Claire, smiling with trophy ribbons we'd long since stopped counting. The other was invisible: items my parents would buy, favors they would grant, excuses they would make. Claire, for all her charm and comfortable grades, came with a soft landing. When she scraped a B+, my parents treated it like a crisis that required intervention. Tutoring, a new laptop, a face-to-face talk about how to manage the next steps. They said things like, "We'll help her through. She's figuring things out." It always sounded so noble. It always landed like favoritism. When I brought home an A in calculus, the fridge might get a magnet with my name, but the celebration never extended past a clipped "good job." If I asked for help filling out a scholarship form, the response was practical advice and a look that suggested I should already know better. From early on, I was assigned roles. I was the one who could be trusted to remember things, who could hold tension without breaking. My parents handed me schedules and expectations as if my shoulders were a public good. I worked evenings at a bakery in high school because that's what you do when you're independent, I suppose. I tutored younger kids in the afternoons, not because anyone asked me to, but because homework was how I learned to quiet the voice that kept whispering I didn't deserve help. I learned to translate praise into an uncomfortable, transient warmth that passed quickly, just like sunlight through blinds. The message was consistent. Claire needs assistance, and we will pour ourselves into her because she is, for whatever reason, fragile in ways we must protect. Amy is strong, and strength means you don't get the soft things. Strength means you carry the soft things for everyone else. When I cried once on our back porch after a breakup, my father patted my shoulder and said, "You'll be okay, you're tougher than you look." I remember thinking then that toughness had a cost. Every time I picked myself up, someone else counted me as having been paid in full for whatever happened. There were little moments that added up into a pattern. When Claire needed a new car to get to interviews, we co-signed and wrote checks. When I needed summer tuition for a summer math program, I got a list of scholarships I should have applied for and a good luck. At family dinners, conversations would orbit Claire's social life and future like satellites, polite, invested. And when I tried to steer the talk towards something I'd done, it was as if I'd changed the channel in the middle of a movie. My parents' pride in me was real, but it always came wrapped in a condition. I must be self-sufficient first, exceptional second. The phrase, "the strong one," became a kind of armor I wore badly. Armor is supposed to protect. Mine was a costume that made me invisible. I began to believe strength was a bill you had to repay with silence. No asking, no askingment, no entitlement to gentleness. On my bedpost, I kept awards and certificates stacked like thin bricks. People would glance at them and say, "You're doing great, Amy," but their tone never carried the unexpectedness of true surprise. They noted my competence more than my personhood. Self-esteem, for me, took the shape of cautious confidence and private dread. I was proud of the late-night study sessions, the way I figured out proofs and then explained them to classmates. But somewhere under that pride lived the thought that every success required sacrificial solitude. I valued my intellect, and I resented the way it was treated like a practical tool rather than a part of me worthy of care. The result was a curious mixture. I pushed myself harder because recognition didn't feel safe, and I felt guilty for wanting recognition at all. My friendships sometimes filled in the gaps my family left, but they couldn't rewrite the script I'd been given. I learned to swallow questions about help like pills. Necessary, bitter. I kept a mental ledger that balanced expenses and effort against returns and approval. It never balanced in my favor. That sense of being punished for working hard, for being the person who did not ask for handouts because she had been told not to, hardened into a low-grade fury I carried to bed. Part of me believed then, and believed for long stretches, that my parents were right to teach me to stand alone. There's dignity in resilience, I told myself. But another, louder part wanted to scream that strength doesn't have to be a sentence. The friction of those two ideas generated the heat that, years later, would either burn me out or forge me into something else entirely. I couldn't have known which at 16. All I knew was that being the strong one felt less like a compliment and more like a sentence someone else wrote for me, and I was still trying to learn how to edit. They told me, with the same calm voices they used for splitting chores and setting curfews, that Claire would get financial help for college. The sentence hung in the kitchen like a dish towel on a hook, ordinary, useful, and there for whoever reached for it first. My mother said it with that soft moral certainty she reserves for things she's already decided are true. Claire's grades aren't great? We'll help her. You'll be fine. You can get a job and save. My father nodded, as if the math of it added up. That was the moment I learned how praise and punishment can wear the same face. It wasn't couched in cruelty. There were no lectures about fairness, no "we love you less" declarations. It was quieter, cleverer, a policy framed around need, where need was defined by emotional fragility and not by effort or merit. Claire, with her B-minuses and boy problems and extracurriculars that looked pretty in the yearbook, qualified as fragile. I, who'd skinned my knuckles on proofs and spent weekends converting textbooks into something resembling a job, qualified as strong. Strong didn't get subsidies, apparently. Strong got a stern pat and a list of options. So, I made a list. It was the sort of list that feels like armor: scholarships, part-time job shifts, application deadlines, recommendation letter requests, essay prompts. I printed calendars, color-coded deadlines, and taped the thing to the inside of my bedroom closet door so I would see it every time I dressed. The list was both a map and a ledger. For every one of my parents' "you'll be fines," I logged 2 more hours at the bakery or an extra late night drafting essays. Work became a constant cadence. Early mornings at the bakery, the fluorescent hum, the smell of coffee and baking sugar, the ritual of counting change with shaky fingers, then school, then tutoring sessions where I explained algebra to kids who thought logarithms were a type of sandwich. Saturdays were for AP prep and faffing through practice tests. Sundays, I would steal 2 hours to breathe. I learned to study in bad light and to carry snacks for when my stomach knotted itself into a tight fist halfway through a proof. There were micro-humiliations that piled up. Claire got a new laptop when the old one couldn't handle her dance videos. I got a lecture on time management when I asked if the family could chip in for the summer math program's fee. When I mentioned applying to more selective schools, my mother said, "Are you sure those places are practical? Don't want to set your hopes too high." It felt like a containment effort that disguised itself as prudence. The real message was, aim low enough that we don't have to rearrange our lives for you. At school, the guidance counselor, Mr. Alvarez, was different. He saw the stack of AP scores in my folder and the way my hands shook when I talked about scholarships, and he said things that both warmed and made me ache. "Amy, apply for everything. I'll write your recommendations. You have a shot at national scholarships." He wrote letters with phrases like intellectual maturity and work ethic beyond her years. He pushed me toward opportunities I hadn't even known existed. He believed, in the merciless way good mentors do, that talent deserved fuel. But belief from outside the house didn't pay the utility bill. When it came time to actually bridge the gap, for applications that required a fee for a prep course that would help my SAT score, my parents handed me the same list of comforts they always did. Grants my sister might need, opportunities to find money on my own, a sober, "you'll manage." Their version of support had a loophole. It required me to be exceptional enough to not need them. Spoiler, I took that loophole as an instruction manual. The more I pushed, the more exhausted I became, and the more my anger turned precise. I wasn't angry about the work itself. I was angry about the framing. I had been tacitly assigned the role of the family's emotional workhorse and then told to pay for my own harness. It felt like punishment for competence. Your smarts disqualify you for aid because apparently strength is a budget item. I remember one night in particular, a quiet late October evening when rain skittered against the window and I had 3 essays due and a double shift at the bakery the next morning. Claire bounded into the kitchen, laughing about a scholarship webinar she'd barely attended because she'd overslept, and my mother said, "We'll call them back and see what they can do." "It's okay, sweetheart." The word "we" landed like a small stone in a still pond. My hands were ink-stained from my scholarship application drafts. I set them down and said slowly, "Do you mean us as in the whole family, or you as in you and Claire?" My voice was a scalpel. My mother blinked. My father said, "It's a different situation." Different, right? So I doubled down. Nights grew into a rhythm of exhaustion and stubbornness. Work, study, apply, sleep in fits. I taught myself to write essays that read like someone who had lived in the margins and was learning how to push back. I learned how to turn the small humiliations into evidence of resilience rather than proof I deserved them. My handwriting in those application essays looked like a legal brief and a love letter at once. Meticulous, fervent, pleading in its own quiet way. There was a bitter humor to it. I would later laugh, not always kindly, at the irony of filling out forms under a lamp while my parents rewired the family budget to cover Claire's latest need. I'd photocopy recommendation letters and keep them in a battered folder labeled, "For Amy, do not open if you don't want to be inspired." I kept a spreadsheet of deadlines and a second one of scholarships I'd been rejected from. The rejections read like a roll call of dignity, taxed and returned. Alongside the practical work was a private inventory. How many times I had to prove myself before someone treated me like I mattered. How much of my worth felt self-declared versus acknowledged. When classmates asked how I balanced everything, I smiled and gave the standard answer: discipline, focus, and saved the rest for the nights when the house was quiet and the list on my closet flap looked more like a hymn than a plan. There were moments of pure, ridiculous hope. Once, on a late winter evening, I found a small scholarship note in my mailbox, $500 for high-achieving students in STEM. I sat on the curb and cried, partly from relief and partly from the oddity of being moved by something so small. It felt like currency in an economy where emotional labor had no denomination. By the time graduation loomed, I was a machine in human skin, competent, exhausted, somehow luminous in a weary way. I had interviews, essays, recommendation packets, a worn-out resume that made the case more convincingly than the house ever had. Each acceptance letter I tucked into my folder felt like a small, private victory, a proof that the ledger could be balanced on my terms. I did not yet know that one of those victories would be larger than I dared to hope, and that the truth of what I'd earned would pull the rug out from under the story my parents had told themselves for years. But I felt the shift. The rage that had been a low-burning ember grew into something more directed than bitter. It became the heat that would forge a different ending. The punishment for being competent had only made me more deliberate. I was tired and furious and meticulous. The combination, as it turns out, of someone about to change the equation. The envelope was heavier than it looked. I sat on the edge of my bed and held it for a long minute, like a guilty secret. Claire was in the next room, trying on dresses for graduation photos. The house hummed with the ordinary domestic soundscape of dishes and someone playing a playlist that always made me think of plastic cups and lukewarm punch. When I opened it, the top line read, "Congratulations, full scholarship to Harvard University." For a second, my knees betrayed me and I had to sit down. The scholarship covered tuition, room and board, and even some books. It was, in the blunt currency of our life, a full stop on every sentence my parents had been drafting about me for years. The "you'll be fines," the thinly veiled practical admonitions, the quiet calculus that my competence meant I didn't deserve softness. I heard them before I saw them. my parents' footsteps in the hall, then the polite, practiced clapping, the kind you give at a school talent show when you want to be encouraging but not suspiciously enthusiastic. Claire came in, eyes bright. "Amy, open it. Open it." She flung herself onto my bed, and my mother hovered like a bureaucrat waiting for a signature. My father kept his hands in his pockets as if containing his feelings might contain the news too. They feigned surprise, then shared a grin behind their practiced masks. "Honey, that's," my mother began, a ribbon of pride threaded with something else. "We're so glad you got the scholarship," my father said. "This is good for you." They said the words the way you check an item off a to-do list. Efficient, tidy, final. There was a pause in the kitchen later, the three of us standing around the counter like suspects in a mystery where the conclusion had already been decided. My mother's hand smoothed a dish towel the way she smoothed conversations away from unhelpful directions. "We're proud," she said, and I could see her doing the math in her head. What this meant for the family budget, for Claire's upcoming applications, for whether they'd still need to be the kind of parents that rearranged months and emotions around one child's need. I felt anger at myself for feeling anger, but it was there. Sharp. Clean. "I worked for this," I said, louder than I'd planned. "I worked my ass off for this. It's not your generosity to congratulate me for not needing you." My words were a scalpel, but they weren't intended to cut. They were intended to show the cut. My father's face closed around that sentence like someone listening to a truth they hadn't budgeted for. My mother blinked, then opened her mouth in that way people do when they're trying to find the polite shape of a defense. "We," she started, then stopped. "People are practiced at polite defenses. They're less practiced at the admission that the script they've been reciting has been unkind." I could have kept it private. I could have swallowed my bitterness and been the strong one, the way they liked, stoic and grateful. But that armor had always been a one-way street. It allowed them to be soft and I to be hard. The revenge I'd been thinking about for months didn't need to be dramatic. It only needed to be true and public enough to be undeniable. Graduation felt like the place to do it. I wasn't scheduled to speak. I wasn't the valedictorian. But I had learned to be strategic in small, careful ways. A week before, I'd asked Mr. Alvarez if he would introduce the scholarship recipients from our school at the ceremony. He told me later, with that sly, conspiratorial grin of a man who has spent his life quietly upending expectations, that he would, and that I should be ready to say a few words if the moment came up. On the stage, under the hot lights and the muffled roar of family chatter, my name was read. I walked up and felt the familiar weight of people's eyes. Neighbors, teachers, the faces that had watched me fold myself into someone useful. Mr. Alvarez nodded at me from the wings like an accomplice. I took the microphone. "Thank you," I said, because manners are useful armor, too. The applause filled my ears and then faded to a hum. I had rehearsed this 5 ways in my head, but never without a pulse of nervousness. I could have gone the humble route, the safe route. Instead, I gave them a mirror. "I won't pretend I've done this alone," I said. "There are people in this room who helped me puzzle application forms together, who wrote recommendation letters, who stayed up late making sure I didn't miss a deadline. Mr. Alvarez did those things. My friends did those things. Scholarship committees did those things." I looked out at my parents and kept my voice steady. And to my parents, thank you for the tough love. Thank you for telling me I was strong. It made me strong. But strength shouldn't mean you're disqualified from kindness. You taught me how to stand. I learned how to do it without falling apart, but I also learned that standing isn't supposed to be lonely. The applause after that was uneven. Some people applauded the sentiment, others the show. What I said landed like a mirror held up to the people who'd been telling a story about me for years. It was not an accusation, exactly. It was an observation with teeth. Later, at home, the confrontation we'd been avoiding finally happened in the small, domestic ways that real apologies do. My mother sat at the kitchen table, the dish towel from earlier now a casual, defeated thing in her hands. My father had a softness in his eyes I hadn't seen there since I was 10. They spoke in fragments, apologies wrapped in practical language. "We didn't realize," my mother began, then let it go because even that phrase had weight. We thought we were doing the right thing. We thought you could handle it. My father's voice came in low. We were scared Claire would flounder. We thought helping her would be helping the family. I'm sorry we used you as the excuse to avoid the hard work. Their apology wasn't cinematic. It was a slow unspooling, like someone learning to read the map of their own mistakes. They apologized for the way they'd praised me by withholding comfort. They apologized for making my resilience a reason to abdicate responsibility. It was not instant absolution. I wasn't looking for a clean fix. But it was real. The revenge had not been a public humiliation or a petty cruelty. It was the simple act of refusing the role they wrote for me and naming it in front of people who mattered. I made the success undeniable and then told the truth about how it had been earned. The embarrassment, the small public recalibration of how they saw me, was the irony. They had taught me to be invisible behind competence. My scholarship made me visible in a way they couldn't ignore. That visibility made them confront the ledger they'd been keeping. A week later, my mother folded my acceptance packet into her hands and said, quietly, "We're proud of you, Amy. We were wrong about how we handled things." There were tears, awkward and earnest, and apologies that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner because that's the scent of our family. I accepted their apology with boundaries. I had learned the value of both mercy and distance. The scholarship was my ticket out, but it wasn't an erasure of everything that had come before. I left for Harvard with a suitcase, a scholarship letter, and a new, quieter kind of self-respect. The revenge I had wanted, the one that wasn't mean so much as fair, was this. I gave myself the future they had told me I didn't deserve, and I made them watch me build it. That, more than anything else, was relief.